So I'll go ahead and I'll introduce David Lewis, who will be moderating the discussion.
Great.
So, David.
Great. Excellent. First of all, Derek, I want to thank you and Alexa for putting together this talk and setting up the tone for issues of looking at light from a multifaceted standpoint, from the standpoint of cultural conditions, of memory, of time, of experience, of technology, of even professional conditions. And so the first question that I have, and I'll frame it to each of you, all comes from essentially pulling from Derek's introduction, which is to set up the position we're in today, which is if you look at solid state lighting as not just light, and I'm going to make a proposal here, but the way in which we understand solid state lighting is effectively a remediation of a previous technology, incandescent or fluorescent, but that is only one part of a much broader set of possibilities that include issues of time, issues of memory, issues of ability to reference, imitate, if not represent nature, to challenge the way in which we understand interior and exterior space through the issue of light, but it's light now understood as data. If that's the case, what's then the greatest potential, Kevin, in terms of what is possible for this technology that may be teased at, touched upon, but you think has the greatest impact from your standpoint? And I'm going to ask a similar question.
Well, the sort of easy answer was that we can replicate what came before. And it's funny because no light source has ever completely died, has never completely gone away. Candles are still a multi-billion-dollar industry. So we tend to try to build what we're used to, and that will undoubtedly continue. It has for hundreds of years now, even with the introduction of gas and other artificial light sources. But if you're asking, what's the biggest potential for that source? I think, and we just had a couple of quick discussions around the issue of controls. One is dimming and one is doing things in an easy way for it. Right now it's too complicated and it's too expensive. And there's no reason, because we have microprocessors and doorknobs today. I mean, it's the ubiquity of microprocessors should allow us to be able to do lots of different things today. So I think it's that marriage of control with the solid state lighting devices, and the sort of pragmatic concerns of cost and so forth have to continue to improve, but I think that's probably the biggest thing that we have, and that will certainly tie into what you said in terms of tying nature into rooms and being able to reflect what's going on outside, inside, and so forth.
Great. Adam, let me push the same question to you, but now frame it in terms of your disciplinary position as an architect, negotiating oftentimes and exploiting the dichotomy between interior and exterior. If that dichotomy is predicated upon the existence of daylight being exterior, what happens when the light source can replicate that translation but now interior to the building?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I mean, controls was something that I was going to mention. I think for reasons of energy efficiency, if nothing else, the notion that daylight, can be optimized when possible, within an interior environment, will probably become more prevalent. But it's that kind of gradient, the sort of infinite possibility of calibrating a kind of gradient between daylight and electric light that is something we're not accustomed to, that I think is going to become ubiquitous precisely for the reasons that you talked about. And I don't really know where it leads. I think if anything, I don't know we could generalize in terms of the kinds of projects. We do a pretty diverse range of work, and so it might depend on the specific circumstances how that would play itself out. But I don't think, for instance, windows are going to go away now because we can replicate that inside. So in that sense, if for no other reason, but it is something that I think we're only barely beginning to get a sense for what's possible. Honestly, we're just not even aware, remotely. But we see these types of things in more temporary installations and kind of pilot projects of that type, and less in kind of architectural installations. But again, they'll be more prevalent for sure.
Just do a follow-up in terms of both in terms, how does this shift, or what is the a possibility for the shift in terms of the professional disciplinary conditions that you have. In other words, if what you're working on in a collaboration with an expert in lighting is set currently based upon lighting from a fixture, how does that change when you start thinking about lighting in as a much more immersive condition, one that's not purely about setting up illumination, but itself becomes an animated character within the projects?
I mean, I think like any collaborator we work with, the people who we tend to gravitate toward for more successful collaborations pull back and look at the kind of conceptual framework for the project, which again is never a given in the sense that we don't sort of write this down and then dictate it to everyone we're working with, but it's something that emerges from the kind of collaboration we have with the client, with others. So I think the more successful, let's say, lighting designers, if that's the kind of professional term being used, who can kind of participate in that and think about qualities of space, and experience, and then about the means to achieve that, perhaps, but always knowing, because they're the ones who exist within that kind of disciplinary silo, knowing what's possible, bringing that to the table. I think that's where we probably have had in the past and will continue to have kind of more successful collaborations and design work.
Yeah. Because this issue of collaboration is also essential to the work of the production of repositories of memory, if that's a fair term for the work that you're working on. And I'm curious that in your description of the potential or the failure of current museums of history to reify the artifact, to see the original as somehow having authenticity that exceeds and no longer carries the power that it used to have in a mediated culture. A lot of the work we're proposing or showing sets up the light as an animated character within it, but light from more traditional sources. As you started teasing out in the last project the possibility of LED to engage issues of time, plus other technologies of light to play on the issue of marking, inscription, editorial condition, engaging issues of time, systems kick on or off, where do you see the immersive potential, which you call the phantasmagorical, of future exhibitions when you no longer even need the artifact itself, but the very image of the artifact can be replicated so distinctly and through time-based medium?
Yeah, I mean, it's this question that you're asking, which is, I think, a really important question, is part of a lively conversation that's going on in the world of exhibition design and museology right now. And history museums have remained perhaps almost more attached to their objects than certainly art museums have, given the larger turn within the culture towards kind of transmedial type forms. But I think. I am a cultural historian. I was actually trained as a medievalist, and the sort of approach that interests me is an approach that would continue to leverage the expressive power of a whole range of technologies, and most of the ones I showed you here were pretty crude, sort of analog ones, and anything that could expand the compass and reach and power of those sorts of strategies interests me. But I also am interested as a historian in creating points of friction between these kind of spectacularizations of the document, the archive, this sort of hallucinatory, phantasmagoric ambition, and the kind of physicality of that face-to-face experience with the document, the object, and so forth. And I think the really productive space is in the friction between those two, where we get to have it both ways in a sense. And it's embedded in that approach, I think, is also an answer to the question of audience, because the critique that comes from this was the critique, by the way, advanced by all of the communities of historians who were part of these design processes in some kind of large collaborative way at some point or another was, well, if, it's all fine and well to, transform into a kind of immersive spectacle, these important materials that document stories of human suffering, the great events of, early 20th century history. But what is it that you're obscuring, that you're losing? That where's the kind of attention to detail, to those kinds of points that make all the difference to understanding why one form of violence signifies X and another form of violence signifies Y? And of course, those are legitimate objections. And so the answer to that question, I think, is finding that balance often between the demands of, in a sense, when I say the kind of demands of a kind of spectacularization on the one side, and that's where I think lighting as well as sound design plays a central role. And on the other side, the ability to create this further dimension that is always talking back to those purely experiential, immersive kinds of models. At least that's the way I've pursued the issue. I would love to be able to experiment with programmable environments that go far beyond the very crude programmability of the sorts of environments I was talking about this evening.
I mean, the other thing that's interesting to me about the projects you proposed or presented is just this notion that, you don't have to actually go to a museum to see this documentation. So this kind of creation of an experience that then very powerfully bonded to the space or the site where either something actually happened, like the second project you showed, or just to this incredibly unusual kind of context that immediately takes you out of your familiar surroundings, it seems to me, to enrich the experience, the very purpose of a museum, and makes it a kind of collective event, as opposed to, and then within that, of course, sound, light, other things can transform the scale and create a kind of connection that you just wouldn't get if you just were scrolling through the internet and looking at. They probably have websites anyway with all this documentation on them. So that sort of social dimension and that visceral connection.
Just one footnote. In the case of the exhibition of World War I, we did an experiment with, so we had the apparatus for the immersive environment in the form of all of the source clips, the information from the archives, in a recreation of the site in Second Life in a virtual world. So the idea was to reverse the priority. Like you'd expect the labels in the museum, we had the labels. So if you wanted to replay the experience that you were immersed in, you could do it, but only off-site.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that you're talking about establishing a dialectic between what is both the experiential condition and the knowledge base. That you end up having to, you're trying to frame a condition in which someone is self-conscious of the experience that they had as experience, while at the same time recognizing that there are other forms of knowledge that are not possible to be received within that process. And Kevin, in part, this raises for me one of the questions that you set up almost at the end of your talk, which is to say, on one hand, there's this spectacular new technology, and it's all the things it can do. It, in fact, can do other things. So to sort of channel Paul Virilio, every technology comes also with the production of its own accident, the unanticipated consequences. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about, what are the potential things at the point in which this technology is now being adopted wholesale and in ways for really good reasons. What should we be aware of? What should we be self-conscious of as discipline, as designers, as historians, as professionals, as we move along with a technology and its seeming other side?
One of the more obvious ways, if we look back at the advent of the electric light source, it did so many things. It lengthened the day in so many ways, which had enormous social consequences. It lit up rooms. It lit up tenements. There's actually a very nice series and book, I think, by Stephen Johnson recently talking about 6 innovations that have changed the world, and one of them is on light, and I think it's on Netflix now or something like that, I'm sure. And he talks a little bit about the social change that was wrought by the advent of the electric light source. So go forward 125 years, we now have solid-state lighting, we have LEDs, they're already being used to replicate what has gone before. Now it's the next part of that new medium, and I have to say, it would be tough to predict exactly what's happening, but look at things like Kickstarter, look at things like what people are doing with them on objects and things in their environment. That is where things are moving towards. With LEDs as information sources, with LEDs being used in, and there's some fascinating work in optogenetics right now using LEDs that are implanted in the brain. There are some really amazing things that are going to be transforming how we think and how we use, not just light, but how we think and use information as well. But I hesitate, I forget who said it, but, prediction is hard, especially about the future. So, maybe it sounds like a verism, yeah. But in all of that, look to how it is changing our lives. We talk about combining a digital source with processing, with memory, with all these other things that are already in our daily lives. The next steps are not going to be predictable. I think lighting companies will change. They're going to be looking for opportunities where it's not simply lighting a room. It's going to be actually adding information to a room or taking information out of a room. Because the lighting can be now, it's been called the Trojan horse, because you can now immerse other things into it, whether it's sensing, networking, digital data. We had a concept years ago which we called the Nest. This is long before the other Nest came up, but it was a combination of microphones and speakers and lights and atmospheric sensors and the like, all as one unit. So lighting is no longer alone, and your ability to combine that with other things, I think, will change a lot of the way we do things in our environments.
We've definitely seen that, with some of the clients we've had and consulting we've done, where the boundaries are completely blurred between who's making what now. Is an electrical company a lighting company? Is a furniture company a lighting company? Right. It's very unclear, and I guess depending upon the scale of the investment, then that decision becomes more important, critical. But right now, everything's very much in flux.
Yeah. But so much of Adam, so much of the power of the work that you showed rests upon the understanding of natural systems, of having a cycle and a process through the day. Are there challenges with the arresting of that, or the remanipulation of that, or are we seeing an added plus? In other words, as you think about the relationship not only of interior space but buildings and landscape, also, how does this change our understanding of the very concept of a room, when the ability to manipulate illumination at the urban level? Times Square is obviously presented as exemplar, but it's not the anomaly. There are huge billboards that change entirely the illumination of urban space in a way that used to be only done in a living room, right? How does that shift their expectations for what constitutes architecture and our relationship to natural systems?
It can be very disorienting, actually. I was staying at a hotel in Vancouver about a year ago, and the room had an iPad-controlled lighting system that was so sophisticated and connected to the window shades and everything else, that I felt like, and again, it wasn't a fairly large space. It was maybe 400 square feet, including the bathroom and the foyer, and so I'm always uncertain how much optionality is actually necessary or productive. And anyway, it took quite a while to figure out what was going on. And then if you just want to, get up and leave, you've got to go through a kind of sequence. It's like being in an Apollo mission. So I'm kind of a bit of maybe a, Luddite in that respect. But I still think that the relative brightness of the sun is so many more times greater than any kind of electric illumination that can be created, and to the extent that people still exist, in the above ground spaces, and we don't have a kind of autonomous robots occupying here, and then we're down underground yet, but that will be a
couple years.
Experience. Yeah, exactly. I just hope they're kind to us. But so I think it's a relative thing. I guess it's a question of, if you have a hammer, you look for nails, and I don't know whether the economics might just temper that, and then to what extent function actually drives this when there's actual value, through some functional benefit. But I would say that we're very open to exploiting any of the opportunities this might have. But again, we would probably do them more on a case-by-case basis relative to the actual intentions that we were thinking about for a project, which sometimes are grounded in a specific idea about light, and sometimes light is incidental to that. It's not necessarily the driver, so to speak.
But wouldn't that experience you had in Vancouver, wouldn't that have been more useful if it wasn't for that interface? Right? Would you have welcomed that?
Yeah, I think so. No, I do. I do. I mean, I think, or just simplifying that control package, but I do wonder, there were so many layers of lighting present that it seemed sort of unnecessary, like how many, if there's 6 different ways of using the room, does each one have to have its own specific lighting? Or, but again, I'm sure that that's a feature that's, sold as part of the package.
Yeah, I think there's a big chunk of that question that has not just to do with the success or failure of interface designs, but also with the culture. And with, if you think about the degree to which people customize the interfaces on their phones or on other devices, it was an incremental process that led to an increasingly higher degree of customization. And I think as people get used to experiencing physical space as programmable in some ways, that it'll become more and more natural, actually, to think about what those programs signify and how they express, values, interests, needs, And I think we're still very early in that curve, development-wise.
But the other way to look at controls is the best control system is one which immediately understands exactly what you want. In fact, doesn't have to ask a question, which means that the issue of control may not resolve here, but it resolves somewhere else, which raises the issue, Kevin, that you were talking about, of issues of power and privacy. And I wonder if anyone wants to pick up on this issue of, where is it that where does privacy exist in the body or in the cultural body with a changing information age in which light is now information, effectively?
Well, this is a tangent from light, but I was taking the subway up here from our office, 2 stops. But there was an advertisement for Foursquare talking about how different people, it will tell you where you can get the kind of food that you like in the neighborhood that you are in. And it has 2 people standing next to each other on the subway, one of whom wants Chilean sea bass and the other one wants chili cheese fries. And I just wondered, does that mean if you like that kind of food, that's the only kind of food that you ever get to know about? So maybe they'll have some algorithm that, throws in a little bit of variety once in a while, because you might like both, so that's kind of, independent of lighting. But I think it sort of shows the technology where there's this immediate belief that, your pattern of behavior is something that should be the basis of future behavior. I just don't understand that. It seems like a kind of, I know why someone would sell advertising space in terms of that, but does that actually correspond to what might satisfy you? I'm not positive about that.
So what I'd like to do is to be able to have about 15, 20 minutes left to be able to open the questions to the audience. I know we have a online audience that may be posing questions. So does anyone at this point have curious interests, otherwise known as questions?
I'm interested in if anybody's done any research, so we can get it on the... Okay. Interested in if anybody's done any research or studies on the health benefits or lack of health benefits of LED lights. I'm familiar with artificial environments and people sensitive to fluorescent lights and different wavelengths, and people have spoken a lot about full spectrum light. And of course, we all enjoy a walk outside in natural fresh air and natural light and daylight, and it's helpful to work under those environmental conditions. What does LED lighting do for that or not do to that kind of an environment?
Well, there's a pretty sizable body of work around the effects of light on health, vitamin D and seasonal affect disorder and so forth. But that applies to really any light source having sort of the right tuned wavelengths and so forth. So LEDs can certainly do that. And most of those studies were done under more traditional sources. But if you're talking about in addition to that, other potential health benefits because they're LEDs, I really don't know of a lot of work being done in that area. But certainly because you can tune the source, because you can tune the spectrum, you can make it more like sunlight, you can make it more like something that definitely has a physiological effect on the body. There are certainly opportunities for LEDs to provide reasonable health benefits. So you have to look carefully at the literature, though. There's some research out there that's a little off the fringe. They make pretty exorbitant claims for kids will get smarter under this source and not under this source. But having a well-lit environment is really important. That's sort of like a baseline. And then from there, you can look at other sort of physiological benefits. But I don't know of a lot of literature specifically around LEDs in that category, though.
There is a webcast as part of the Luminous Talks 3 that is the preamble that Rayon Brand and Laura Taylor did from Philips that addresses this and does it in a pretty interesting way, having to do with the research that's happening at Philips on the connection between light and particularly healthcare. And that would be one place to look at, and it's on the Luminous Talks website.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's been an enjoyable evening. My question really is about architectural education and interior design, because it seems to me over the years that I've found that interior designers are so much better. I'm very glad that you mentioned Mary Bright. We'll all miss Mary. Who've got that idea, much better idea of creating atmosphere with light, rather than an architect who's generally more concerned with specification and without really anticipating either the activity or the interior space. And I was wondering how Parsons is looking at that in terms of your own departments with architecture and interior design.
Take it. That's a question for the moderator. Derek would be the best person to answer this, but I'll tell you that the way in which we're doing it is we have the School of Construction Environments is set up to have a cross-disciplinary as well as dual degree between lighting, interior design, and architecture, in which lighting becomes the hinge of those disciplines. All right? So that we have incredibly strong faculty as well as students in curriculum set up to do dual and double majors that can explore both the possibility of light, interior design, light, and architecture, and the connection between all three of those disciplines in studios in which they're shared collaborative projects. I think for us it's absolutely essential not to see them as silos that happen to cross at the level of specification and CD wars, but rather, that would be construction documents, but rather at a fundamental knowledge and a respect for disciplinary distinctions.
Could you say a little bit? I'm an architect and a lighting consultant. Could you say a little bit about, if you can speak into this?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Could you say a little bit about the role that beauty plays in what you do professionally and personally? It's sort of a taboo subject in architecture. You can go, I know from experience that you can go through a 3.5-year program and nobody says anything about it. But clearly it's been a major motivating factor in the development of architecture and in the development of lighting. So
Just to clarify, you mean beauty of form or beauty of...
it's an open-ended question. I'm fishing to see what floats to the surface once I throw the hand grenade in the pool.
I mean, there's no, by the way, thank you for asking that the lights come down, and I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge that you were raising your hand there in the back. I wasn't certain what you were, but anyway, that made the slides a lot more beautiful. We're certainly very conscious and motivated by the desire to make something that we think of as beautiful, in the kind of broadest sense of the word. I guess, on a personal level, what excites me in design are projects that have or whatever type they are, have a kind of integrity to them, and an economy and an elegance. And I guess you could say all of those things constitute, and clarity, constitute a kind of sense of what someone might call beauty. But no, I don't think of it as a taboo or anything at all, really, in terms of that. I think what we're always excited by is how that emerges from each project that we work on, and that it's not a predetermined, or a priori specific kind of beauty or outcome that we desire, but that in a good process or with good collaborators or through specific circumstances, you can achieve something that seems to have resonance, seems to feel appropriate, for its place and time. So, but we're very conscious of that and don't think of it as a taboo at all. It's just something that's there, and you kind of toil away, hoping that, and not every project, maybe, just being self-critical, do we feel meets all of those things, but when it happens, sometimes you feel very gratified that it does.
Yeah, if I could, I'll accept your provocation as well. I would answer actually in a very, very convergent way with Adam's answer. I think, what counts as beauty can shift considerably from one project to the next, and sometimes it's precisely accepting certain built-in features of that are givens in a design challenge that you face that seem like the most unpromising elements, like the cracks in the wall of a tunnel or the terrible acoustics, and turning those into expressive elements. I mean, I think that is the challenge of coming up with successful solutions. Often, it's really paying attention to those built-in affordances, I think.
But I'd like to follow up on the question from the standpoint of Kevin. You showed two images. It was James Turrell, a particularly unbeautiful space without the illumination. And is that good? In other words, from the standpoint of the fact that you can have a project or a building or a space that in and of itself with other kinds of, whether it's daylight or otherwise, isn't particularly well done, it doesn't have the right proportions, it's not really nice space you want to be in, but with the right lighting, it becomes a beautiful space. Is that space in and of itself beautiful, or is the question of light, whether it's artificial or natural, the key condition for the definition of beauty?
Well, part of it had to do with the flash which illuminated that space. Single point source, everything out, and all you get imaged back. There's no relief, literally and figuratively. And so there's no texture to the walls as a result. So was the space beautiful or not? No, it was a gray basement color, basically. But it's possible to have great materials and textures and light sources that graze and illuminates in a way that reveals that structure and underlying texture as well. That does make it beautiful, and it can be beautiful without you can have a very well designed lighting plan, but it may not detract from the beauty of the walls. Hopefully, it'll add to it. But I guess I haven't really used the term beauty in these cases. More about what is the aesthetic that the lighting artist or lighting designer has intended, and does it add to it? Or does it subtract from it? I mean, there's plenty of bad lighting examples out there too. So, if people are purely lighting to standards, you're just, I got to illuminate to whatever it is, how many foot candles at the floor, then you can end up with some pretty bad designs. But it meets the letter of the regulation.
It's interesting where you see this, or I've seen this, has been in seeing a skilled lighting designer illuminate artifacts or objects in an exhibition, where you really see the transformation. That's really quite remarkable, because it's a little bit like the photo you took with the flash shot versus the kind of depth or whatever effect you might want to achieve, but how that can be done through careful, skillful use of illumination. So certainly for exhibition design and to a lesser extent, but equal extent, spaces as well, it definitely makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. To what extent was that question of the aesthetic expectation central to the collaborative discussion you had in the production of the ski piece, because there's something incredibly striking about it, but at the same time, there's a dissonance that occurs from the singularity of the color, and wonder whether or not this issue of the reception of the viewer going to that exhibition or the others becomes a subject for or a goal, or is it simply part of the broader process?
It's a good question. I mean, the ski exhibition was such a speculative exhibition in the sense that we looked at a lot of models of like sports museums. Nothing could be worse. I mean, I don't know if any of you would have the pleasure of visiting sports museums, but talk about, you know, sort of practices of museology that could use some innovation and improvement. So we worked completely, the team that worked on this, which was a team of designers based in Milan and some local designers in Trento, were completely puzzled by what a ski exhibition could or should be, and we came up with what was essentially an experiment that was not at all user tested or even run by the international ski authorities. They provided us with a lot of footage, raw materials, and they pretty much left in our hands the invention of this little conceit. Generally speaking, it was actually better received than I would have anticipated. I had my doubts. But it was purely speculative, and I'm not sure it's necessarily a correct answer to the question of what, you know, how one can tell such stories.
Do you agree to the fact that society has become more interested in lighting during the past years, and do you have reasons for that, besides LED technology?
Maybe I can start the answer. I think it's a great question. I actually think that, I think no. I think society has been fascinated by lighting since the advent of lighting, and my piece of evidence is going to be what otherwise might seem like a puzzling privileging of lighting in Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media. The first example of a media revolution is lighting. And McLuhan was trained as a medievalist. He's a historian of the 19th and 20th century novel. He was acutely aware of the excitement that accompanied the rise of lighting as a key feature of everyday life. And I think he's registering a sense of excitement, opportunity, a kind of projective excitement also that we're experiencing now with renewed vigor because of the transformation that's been taking place. So I think it's a continuing story. That would be my answer.
I wasn't aware of McLuhan's interest in that area. Mostly remember the median as a massage, right? The message.
Light bulbs come first.
Yeah. It's hard because having been immersed in lighting, it's sort of hard because that was what I lived every day. So it's hard to sort of judge in general. But there's certainly been fascination with things like media facades, which is, it's essentially Blade Runner come to life, right? It's if you look at the landscape, the cityscape rather, in a movie like that, it has come to pass, and so there's more interaction with lighting, perhaps, in new and novel ways than there was, 10, 20 years ago.
Siri has something to say.
And yeah, Siri has found her way. Yeah, I'm sort of torn because I think there is some interest. There was a really interesting question about architectural education, but I don't know about all the different architecture programs. Parsons sounds like very progressive and far beyond other programs I've seen in the area of lighting. Typically, it might be a few lectures, maybe a course in 5 years of getting a degree in architecture. So it's not reached the curriculum of folks you would think be the most interested in lighting right now. And then as far as the person in the street, you watch them at Home Depot and they're going, what is this? What does this mean? And what's a lumen? And I think there's a general interest and awareness of LEDs as an example, but beyond that, I'm just not sure. I wish there was more interest. I think it would be great to have more of an education on that. But the only way people pick that up, it's not in their academic curriculums. It's only by being interested in it. And how do you foment that initial interest is, I think, still a very difficult challenge. I think the IES and the IALD and the other societies that work in that area, I always puzzle over that too. How do you drive more interest in lighting?
But I would answer the question by broadening the framework. Essentially, in the phone rang, people looking at a screen. The way in which we engage on a daily basis issues of light, and the fact that if you walk through public space, most people are looking at their phone, which is illuminating their face, but we tend to set up a binary between screens and information and illumination or light. And I think what's interesting, one of the premises of the changing room was to say, what happens if the solid state database driven light isn't distinct or separate from that which we're spending an extraordinary amount of time interfacing with? If that's the case, inevitably the gap between the amount of interest in, particularly in design schools, of light and the fact that how much time you spend with light means that we must change the way in which we understand the teaching of light and what constitutes light. Right? And that is going to happen with LEDs in solid state, but we need to be in a position where we're talking about it critically, intelligently, and with an understanding what the possibilities and the negative consequences are. When we begin to realize that cost issues coming down, that changes the way in which we understand interior conditions, exterior conditions, and mediations to the outside world, which you've talked about as being the digital public space. And that's, I think, a really interesting shift that we need to grapple intelligently from an academic as well as a professional standpoint. Yeah.
I just had the following question about whether artificial light is actually setting us up to really hurt the human being in the sense that we're not getting as much rest. We have all this artificial light that keeps us up and keeps us going and keeps us working and keeps us, the technology and the lighting especially, that where we're awake. And I mean, it seems like, I don't know what you all think about whether artificial light is could possibly be harmful.
Well, I wonder if there's a way to connect that to the last comment. I'm curious whether the discipline of landscape architecture might offer something to the way in which, and its impact on design and the environment, because of how it reframed design in terms of time and performance and attributes not normally, at the forefront of most designers, and whether or not behavior or cycles of time, might in fact inform and underlie lighting more than kind of affect, and again, I'm speaking from ignorance about what the programs, how lighting is taught or anything, and so I don't mean this in any, and this may already be happening too, so because I don't know, but I think it's intriguing to think about, to get beyond and maybe this ubiquity of LED technology and other types of controls could allow it, so that you really start dealing with behavior and then designing that in a way or understanding that, and then the light becomes kind of a secondary tool to cause different, to modify that behavior or whatever. And maybe that's the whole point of this talk, and I just got it, but anyway. Because I do think, there's probably not a wrong or a right. It's kind of everything in moderation. Coffee's okay. If you have like 30 cups a day, maybe that's a problem. But yeah.
I'm not sure if you were alluding more to health issues directly or physiological issues, or...
It just occurred to me that because of artificial light, we're just able to do what we're doing here.
Right.
And otherwise
Good point.
we'd be with candles and we wouldn't be, that's okay.
Right. So it's clear that artificial light has lengthened the day for us, and that's changed a lot of things in the way we operate. There's some evidence, pretty strong evidence actually, that shift workers suffer from certain health issues as a result of working multiple shifts at late nights. So circadian rhythms, melatonin production, all of that has been shown under artificial light. There's some adverse effects of artificial light on some physiological functions like that. But I don't think there's not a chance that we'll go back to not having it. But maybe it's about regulating it. Maybe it is about understanding it so that we can modify artificial light in a way that is beneficial to us and not adversely affecting us.
You know, I think that, Derek, do we have time for one more question, or what's the, okay.
So I'm reading the questions from the live stream, and there was a question that was relating to the impact of artificial light, and it says, perhaps a somewhat frightening question, could there ever be a day that artificial light can replace natural light completely?
Sure. Well, imagine a scenario where you have to live underground, and hopefully some calamity will not happen, but if we had to. But I think we can certainly make the sources replicate any other source, including the sun, right? Maybe the luminous flux value of the sun is extraordinarily high. I mean, Adam pointed this out earlier. If you look at a piece of paper outdoors versus indoors, there's no way we could ever reasonably produce an artificial light source to illuminate the same level you do in a daytime sun. But certainly the spectrum and the timing and the color shifts of color temperature could all be replicated with artificial light. So you could live without natural light if in fact your artificial light source did the right job in the right way.
In part, I think one of the challenges, and I think this is one of the things that the panel has done really well, is to say that there's incredible influence, incredible power, but there's also the need to be able to be self-conscious about it, so that what you can replicate on what's its benefit, but also what are the potential negative consequences that you don't necessarily know, particularly when a new technology comes in, that we can be really quite honest and self-conscious about how it's changing our discipline, question of memory, question of the way in which technology inhabits our daily life in public space. So I want to thank all three of you very much.